Hi there, welcome to Nonsense Whisky. My name's Vin PF, and on today's episode I'm going to be covering my first Taiwanese whisky and my first Kavalan. Now, I haven't covered a Kavalan on the channel yet, and there is a pretty good reason for that. Before I started my channel, I tried some of the Kavalans that were around, and I didn't really get on with them, so I didn't really want to go out and buy bottles, and in the UK at least, Kavalan bottles really are quite expensive. So it's a bit of a push for me to go out there and spend that sort of money without trying it first. Enter in my good friend now, Daniel Brown. He is in Taiwan and he sent me a package recently, a really nice care package, and in it was a couple of Kavalan whiskies. One of them was this. This is the Kavalan single malt whiskey. Funny enough, on here it says Distillers Select. Distillers '(S) Select. But it's the same whiskey as the Distillery Select. The only difference I would say is that in the UK, and obviously in Taiwan as well apparently, it's 40%, but I've seen it in the Americas for 43%. Bit of a shame. Probably go into that in a little bit more. But yeah, thanks to Daniel, I was able to try this before I buy and see if I actually like it or not. I've actually got it underneath coin 171 at the moment, so if you're interested in that coin or any of the others in the range, go and check out the description below and you can see more information about how to get hold of them. Now, a little bit more about Kavalan if you don't know who they are. They are setting the world on fire, to be fair. They're winning awards left, right and centre. Started in 2005, got the first spirits running in 2006, put the first spirits out to market in 2008. So it's a really, really new distillery in the grand scheme of scotches. They're kind of following the kind of Scotch traditions with 2 pot stills there. So they're not trying to break any moulds there, but the interesting thing about it is that the Taiwanese climate, a little bit different to Scotland. Scotland is cold at the day, cold at night, not much difference between those two. You know, if it's freezing in the day, it'll be freezing overnight. If it's hot in the day, it'll be hot at night. In Taiwan, a bit different, very humid, very hot. At night time, the difference in temperature is a lot wider. So we have this different effect where in the day when it's hot, the liquid expands and is forced into the wood, and then at night it contracts again when it cools down and the wood releases that, and you get this kind of cycle day in, day out. Whereas of course in Scotland that expansion isn't so noticeable. Of course, the other downside with the humidity and the heat is they get a much higher angel share, which in turn increases the wood influence on it because the volume goes down but the surface area is kind of getting. There's some sciences involved there, but basically all the crux of it is what you need to know is that you can age it quicker. So for example, you can get a 12-year-old Scotch similar in many, many less years, probably about 3 or 4. I don't know what the curve is. So that brings me on to this. Again, this is the Kavalan Distillery Select. And this is their kind of new bottling, which is meant to be the kind of entry level to their range, the cheaper version. Now I use the inverted quotes because it's still around £50 in the UK. That's not typical for an entry level whiskey, but when you look at the rest of their whiskies, especially their Solist range, which is a confusing range because they have the Solist and then the barrel that it was in, but some of them are single casks, some of them aren't. Some of them are higher ABV, some of them aren't. The batches aren't always the same, so if you've got a Kavalan Solist, ex-barrique, whatever, it might not be the same as the one that I've got, or it's kind of confusing. I don't really know much about that range. I've stayed away from it for a little bit. But this is their new entry level, still quite expensive, especially when I know that there's a 43% version of it knocking around in the world somewhere. A real shame. But the way they've designed this to account for that kind of extra aging that happens, what normally happens is they have to be really careful about over oaking their whiskey. So if they allow it to sit for maybe 6 or 7 years, that might be the same as like 20 odd years in Scotland, and that might put too much oak influence on that whiskey. So for this, they've gone out and selected some refill barrels. So we're talking about stuff that's like had bourbon in it, then it's had whiskey, and then it's had whiskey again in it. It's beaten to death is what I usually like to say, but in this case, the reason why they've done it is they don't want that extra oak influence to kind of spoil it, I guess. They want it to be a nice understated whiskey that you can use kind of neat and for cocktails. They've made it quite clear that that's the idea behind it. So I'm going into this kind of with a bit of trepidation. I'm expecting it to be all right, but not like, you know, blow my mind. I expect it would taste very nice in a cocktail, but I don't usually do that sort of thing on the channel. Let's get into the nose and see what we've got in the glass, shall we? Now for me, it's an interesting nose. I will say that from the moment I poured it and to the moment I'm drinking it and smelling it now, there's been about 20 minutes. Probably a little long, but it has changed in that period of time as well. So it's definitely not one of those ones that if you're going to enjoy it neat, that you chuck it in the glass and put it straight down your neck. I mean, maybe you won't notice any flavour profiles then, but if you're going to enjoy it with a Glencairn and nose and taste, you're going to want to leave it for a little bit to let that initial harshness burn off, I think. I'm getting kind of a vanilla fudginess from it, and then there's some tropical notes in there as well, but it isn't like banana tropical, it's more like kind of mango-y style. It's interesting for sure. Kind of juicy, like we got this thing called a fruit salad in the UK. I'm not sure what's in it. It's a tropical flavour, so it's kind of like that. Let's try on the palate. Now, when you're swishing it about, it doesn't feel that viscous. It feels a little thin to me, but it all happens when you swallow. So it doesn't really taste much of anything while you're swishing it around. Then this huge spice hit kind of comes out of nowhere. It's almost the same as when you drink like a big dirty peaty Isla. Nothing happens to start with, then you swallow, and then all that ashiness follows it. It's like that, but no peat in this. It's just that kind of spiciness. Once that's disappeared, you're getting some flavours of like oranges and more like tropical notes, but there's still quite a large influence of oak in there, which is I'm enjoying it, to be fair, the oaky interest in it, but I can see why they tried to understate that oak a little bit more, because if they have used first fill or even virgin oak for the same amount of time, bear in mind they still have the laws that they have to stick to. In Taiwan it's 2 years to call it a whiskey, but then to sell it in the UK it still has to be 3 years anyway, so it must be 3 years at least. I mean, don't get me wrong, this bottle definitely wasn't intended to be consumed and sold in the UK. It's full of Taiwanese on the back, but we do have a version of this in the UK, so it should be 3 years. Now, the worst part of this whiskey for me is the finish. A little short for my liking. The spiciness sticks around for a good medium-y, longy amount, but that's all there is. All the flavour from it is gone. There's kind of like I don't know, almost like a sour oakiness that's there with the spice. It's not my favourite part of it. I've enjoyed it, that's for sure. Glad to have tried it, but the real thing about it is that it's the price of it over here. For £50, you can get a pretty stellar whiskey over here, I think, depending on what you prefer. It just really isn't worth that amount of money, I don't think, over here. Now, especially if it's designed for a mixer, if you're going to chuck it in stuff, then do you really want to spend 50 quid on a bottle of it when you can get something else that's just as comparable to chuck in there? Yeah, that's all I can say about it really, is that over here, for what is available to me, I would pick probably a whole heap of bottles over it. But it isn't a bad whiskey in any way, shape or form. It just doesn't have that interest in there to meet the price point. And that is a very,